recently released the 100th episode of my podcast, The Nicholas Natali Show, and since February 2019, I've released an episode almost every single week. In this video, I want to show you some of the behind the scenes of what it takes to run a podcast. I've seen many videos on YouTube about starting a podcast, but I haven't really seen any about maintaining and sustaining a podcast. And here's why I think that's important. Around 90% of podcasts stop after the 7th episode, and that's not a hyperbole. I'll link to where I first heard that statistic below. Let's get into it. The format of my podcast is interview style, which means I have to find a guest each week for each episode. We'll call this phase 1. Outreach. There are 3 ways that I find my guests. The first is straight up outreach, and this is exactly how I do it. Instead of mindlessly scrolling through Instagram and TikTok, I'll be going through it looking for a hidden gem. For example, if I come across someone that I think would bring solid insight onto the podcast, I'll save that post or their profile to a specific category inside of my Instagram. Then here's the juice. I'll reach out to them via Instagram DM. And this is the most important part about reaching out. It's the very first thing that's gonna make an impression. Mine is always, want to be on a podcast? And the reason this is important is because when you're sending messages on Instagram, check your own DMs. You'll see that it shows a little excerpt of the first thing that somebody sent you. As soon as they see that little excerpt, they're going to start thinking whether they would want to be on a podcast, and if they do, they're going to open the message. And this is where the tea comes in. I list things that I like about their work, and I list things that I like about them. And that's what a lot of podcasters doing outreach get wrong. I've been on the other side of a cold DM, and they never tailor it to the person. They don't take the time to research the person they're reaching out to. They just copy and paste spam and send it to them. I do not do that. I may never get a reply, but at least I know the messages I'm sending are thoughtful and intentional. The second way I do outreach is through podcast matching sites. The one I use the most is Podmatch.com. Alex Sanfilippo is a friend of mine, and he's the owner of Podmatch.com. It's where they match hosts and guests together, and you get to intermingle to find more people for your podcast. In sites like these, you really have to do your due diligence on the guests that you're choosing. People on these sites have stories, but it's up to you to determine if these stories align with what you want your podcast to accomplish. Thirdly and lastly, the last way I do outreach is I meet people in person, of course. Networking and such. There's been times I'm roaming out in the world and I meet someone interesting and I'm like, you would be a wonderful podcast guest. Shake their hand, they're on the show. It happens. That's networking, baby. Networking 101. Here's a bonus pro tip for scheduling. I don't do this nearly enough. However, the pros will schedule their interviews way in advance. Like they'll be mapped out for months. They'll have 3 months worth of episodes in the backlog that they've recorded, and they just keep on scheduling, and that's the way to do it. Personally, I don't. I make a new fresh episode every single week. I record it and upload it every single week. So it's always really, all of my episodes are really fresh is how I would say that. In addition to time batching your interviews, I've talked to many hosts and they'll do 4, 5, 6 interviews in a day. But everybody has a limit. I've learned that my podcast interview limit is the most I could do is 3 in a day. Max. Phase 2, research. As an interview format podcast, research is crucial. Once I have a guest locked in, I do thorough research on them, and for me that means I go through every single one of their social media posts. If they have 1,000 posts on Instagram, you better believe I'm going through all 1,000 posts. I go through their website. I do multiple search engine searches on these people. I'll go to their friends profiles that they've been tagged in or friends that they've tagged, and I'll search for information on them and their friends profiles. Now, why would I do so much thorough research on somebody before they come on the show? That's a wonderful question. I'm happy you asked. Let's say I have an athlete as a guest on my podcast, and I see posts from them when they're in 8th grade saying coach sucks, coach is this, coach is that. Then they end up playing sports in college and they have posts that are like, I love coach, this coach is my favorite, how much fun is working with this coach? And a good question is why do you get along so well with your coach? And a great question is how did you overcome your rebellion against authority to get to the point where you're at today? And if I don't do this digging, I don't get to find those patterns. I don't find these themes in people's lives. And if I can't recognize those patterns or see those patterns, it puts a barrier to those deeper questions. This thorough research takes a lot of time. Between 12 and 24 working hours is typically what each podcast guest gets. Just digging through their lives. Now I want to have the greatest interview podcast on planet Earth. So to me, this effort is worth it. Phase 3, recording. Once a guest is scheduled, it's time to record, baby. Oh, ooh-wee, have there been some learning lessons here. I use Zencastr to record my audio and video doing virtual interviews, but Zoom, Squadcast, those all pretty much work the same, I imagine. When it comes down to recording, I don't care what mic you're using, these are my hot takes to make sure you get the best out of them. First is don't clip and check your levels. In layman's terms, clipping is when you record so loud, it blows out your digital limit. It's kind of like when you take a picture of the sun and everything is all white. I mean, you took a picture of it, but you can't see the sun.
Clipped audio sounds like this.
Non-clipped audio sounds like this. Some microphones let you set your recording limits, others, like recording on an iPhone, do not. In summation, check your levels so you're not blowing out people's ears. 2, floating mics. If you can float that mic, float that mic. If you're rocking 2 iPhones for your podcast, I would say set them on top of something, get them out of your hands, and have it close to your mic, but not too close to where you're clipping. Let it just stay there. The ATR microphones come with this little stand. This is a good example of floating mic right here. It's not in my hand. It's not, you know, I can't bump it or anything like that. I also rock the Blue Yeti. Blue Yeti is a pretty common microphone. This is what a floating mic looks like with the Blue Yeti. There's even better setups where the mic is suspended from the actual stand, so there aren't any vibrations from moving the mic and all that good stuff. You have to have it where you aren't going to bump into it. That's the key with these floating mics. Very much so you're not catching vibrations from all this other junk in our lives. Pop filters. Rock a pop filter. The benefit of a pop filter is it reduces those like those explosive sounds, those sounds that are really explosive into the mic and clip and make things sound bad, and they just sound disgusting. And it also keeps saliva off your mic when you're talking. If you're rocking the iPhone, you can put a thin sock over it. I have found that that works pretty well. Here's an example of putting a pop filter on an ATR mic, this guy right here. Then you can also see an example of the Blue Yeti with the pop filter and also the pop filter stand. Double protection, baby. Phase 4, your recording environment. Now, I'm not the best example of this, truthfully. I mean, you can take it around. This is where I record the podcast. However, when you're recording your podcast, you're gonna wanna be in a room where the walls are absorbing your sound. This is why you see a lot of people record in closets, because of those clothes absorb the sound and they're not bouncing off of the walls. Your sound waves aren't bouncing off the walls, going straight back into your microphone. That's how echo happens, and also it doesn't isolate your vocals as well. When you're in a contained environment where sound waves can't bounce, you're gonna get more of just your voice rather than all the other things bouncing off and straight into this guy. Phase 5, editing. Once everything is recorded, intros, outros, and the whole show, I'll take those audio files and I'll dump them into Reaper. And that's where I'll begin trimming them down. I'll go through the podcast and I'll trim the fat like stutters, segments that I don't think landed as well as I wanted them to, or even lag from the virtual recording environment. Sometimes I'll ask a question and say, hey, how was your day? My day was good. How was your, you know, you gotta cut that down so it sounds natural. Once the podcast is edited, I'll shoot over to Grant for mixing and mastering. Phase 6, mixing and mastering.
Hi, my name is Grant Singer, and I am the mixer and mastering engineer for Nick Natali's podcast. Here we are in Reaper. This is an audio editing software. Usually where we start is Nick will send me his edited version of the interview. And you can see I keep Nick on the top track here, and his guest, in this case Gabrielle Walsh, she gets her own track. And that way I can adjust both of their voices separately, because they're recording in different places. They might have different sound needs. In the case of Gabrielle, she had some noise in the background, so the first thing that I did is I went through and I EQ'd. This is an EQ. I can cut sound that happens below a certain frequency level, in this case about 100 hertz, which is below where the human voice is usually speaking. So if I play this,
up a lot for me, and
most of the action is happening in the about above 100 up to like 5K. That's where most of the voice is resting. So below that, I just filter out. There might have been some TV noise, maybe a little fridge background noise, that kind of thing. I can just filter that out, and that's usually the first thing that I do. I do that for Nick as well, as you can see. Then I might do some leveling. So in the case of Gabrielle, she was a very, very dynamic speaker. At certain points, she was very loud. At other points, she was very quiet. So I went through and I sort of by hand just adjusted her level. And you can see on my volume here, this is just adjusting when there's a moment where she's very loud, so I brought it down. At this point, she's pretty loud. Other points, she's somewhat quiet, like here. So I lifted her volume. If I don't do that, then you might be listening to this in your car or on headphones, and suddenly something happens that's very loud and you have to turn it down really quickly. Or someone will be talking very quietly for a moment and you'll try to turn it up to be able to hear what they're saying. I don't think anybody should ever have to touch their volume knob when they're listening to a podcast. So this is a big part of mixing for me. It's making sure everything is leveled, the voice sounds consistent throughout the entire podcast, whether they're whispering or yelling or laughing, anything like that. I like to even all of that out. So part of that is done by hand. You can also use a leveler. In the case of this podcast, sometimes I use the leveler built into this program, Isotope RX8. And what that does, this is a sample of one of Nick's intros, and I'll play this for you.
Followers on TikTok with his family. Daniel and his
Pretty standard. There's a couple moments where Nick gets a little loud.
mastered.
When he says mastered.
Mastered.
Yes, there. And
That was the intro.
that. Those are moments you can see on the waveform that get a little bit loud. So I might run a leveler here, and I'll just set it based on the material. So in this case, just set it like that. I set a target level that I want everything to be. It'll go through and it'll make leveling adjustments automatically. And in this case, there's not a lot to do, but you can see that it took down certain areas to make sure that they weren't getting too loud. And I can also make adjustments myself to make sure that those things are not peaking or getting way too loud so that you're having to touch that volume knob on your car or on your headset. So that's the leveling process. Then I'll kind of get everything set up, reduce any noise, any distractions in the audio, birds chirping or any kind of pops, anything like that. I'll go in and I'll kind of adjust those individually. You can also see that I keep the music on a separate track so that I can mix that separately. In the case, we have the mid-roll, ad break.
Episode. And may we never forget, this episode was
So I can adjust the music volume in relation to Nick's voice, all that kind of stuff. Sometimes I may change the timing of some of his edits. If there's anything that seems like it might be a little bit too cut off, I might adjust that once I have everything at the right volume level. It can be hard to hear those things when you're listening back quietly. So I sometimes go through and I just listen to everything back. And when everything is done, I check with a metering plugin. In this case, I'm using levels. I just check to make sure that it's the right loudness that Spotify and other podcast players require, or not require, I guess, but the standard. So the standard is -16 LUFS. For podcast, it's a level that most podcasts are mastered to. So I just double check that this is coming in around -16 LUFS. And I'll play this back for you and you'll be able to see where it's hitting.
Need to do, like, I'm open, you know, like, I'm open, I have nothing left, like, I want to go. And
so you can see at that point it's getting a little quiet, but it's not so much about any individual points. It's about how the podcast is sitting overall. How loud is this podcast in relation to other podcasts on Spotify? If this is in a playlist, I don't want you to have to touch the volume knob because this particular podcast is mastered at a louder or quieter volume in relation to other podcasts that you might be listening to. So the standard, or at least agreed upon level, is -16 LUFS. So I try to mix this podcast pretty close to this. Let's find a spot where we can really see that.
Gabrielle Walsh is an accomplished actress. You may know her from Shameless, 911, The Vampire Diaries, and more. She studied at the Moscow Art Theater.
As you can see, we're about a little over -15. Overall, this podcast will end up at about -16 just because there are quieter parts and it kind of evens out. Basically, that's an average measurement. So can't really get a sense of exactly what the level is until you play back the entire thing and just see what the average level is, because that is what people are most sensitive to. I will render this out as an MP3 for Nick, which is what Spotify prefers when you're submitting a podcast. Many other podcast players also use MP3. The only exception is Apple iTunes, which does ask for M4A, but can also play MP3, so you would be fine either way in that case. I'll just render that out, make sure everything looks good, and that is pretty much it. There's a lot more of the details in making sure that your levels are sitting at the right volume, everything like that, using compression, limiting, all kinds of other things to narrow that dynamic range so that people aren't having to turn up and turn down the volume. But this is kind of a brief overview of what that would be like in the typical day of mixing and mastering.
Phase 7 is uploading it and following up with guests. Once the podcast is mixed and mastered, I'll take that file and upload it onto my hosting provider. I'll write the show notes, gather its media for the podcast cover, and schedule its release. The important thing to me is ensuring that I maintain this relationship with the guests that I just had on. So in addition to sending them the podcast link when everything comes out, sometimes I'll record a video message of me saying, hey, thanks for coming on the show, and I'll send them a 1-minute thing, or I'll write them a thank you note, take a photo of it, and then email it to them. Those 1-minute videos look something like this. I wanted to send this to you as a virtual thank you note for coming on the show, and then I'd also like to say that our episode went live. Then after 4 to 6 weeks, I'll follow up with them again and just ask them how things are going, if there's anything I can help with, and just saying hi. Outside of the podcast standing for something meaningful and helping people live a fulfilling life, the next most important thing for me is making sure I'm making meaningful relationships along the way. I have guests on the show because I want to be friends with them. I want to learn their stories and learn more about them. In the business world, things are often viewed transactionally. If you do this for me, I'll do that for you. And for me, I try to take the exact opposite approach. My strategy is, hey, I just want to be your friend, make awesome things together, and hopefully hang out down the road. Love and relationships are anything but transactional, and I try to reflect that with how I interact with guests after we have recorded an episode. Phase 8, marketing. As with each of these sections, I can probably turn these topics into full-length videos, which I may do if there's a demand for it. In short, chop up pieces of your podcast and turn them into reusable content for other platforms. Blogs work well for podcasts. Make behind the scenes content. And then of course have paid advertising through Facebook ads, Google ads, and YouTube ads. Like I said, this may be a topic to cover in depth in a video sometime down the road in the future. Please listen to the 100th episode of the podcast, and if you like this video, and if you want more podcast content, please comment, hey, I like this, so I know you want more of it. See you in the next one.
Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching. And enjoy this 100th episode celebration.